Most people don't fail at high-tech aquariums right at the startup. Typically they fail right after. This is my 20-gallon high-tech aquarium that's been running for right around 6 months. I'm gonna walk you through exactly what I did to set this up, what I changed, and how I made this high-tech aquarium successful throughout the time that it's been running. This is where the tank ended up. We have a clean foreground, one strong tree, and a dense planted mass building right in the back. And everything looks intentional. This isn't just a build video. This is exactly what I changed, what showed up after, and what it actually took to get exactly to this point that we're at today. Because the setup is easy. What actually people struggle with is keeping it stable. The goal from the start was one main tree, open negative space, and one big island with a dense planted background. It wasn't meant to be a jungle, but something that reads instantly, even in a thumbnail. And that part didn't change. But how did I get exactly here? The first version, I overcomplicated it. It was a disaster. There was too many branches, there was too much going on. I almost had 2 main focal points, and it didn't really read very clean. The biggest fix was removing things. I sorted the branches, then I went and removed anything that was competing with the overall crown of the layout, and then I simplified it down to one clear direction. The second main point was the wood. I actually made it seem like the wood was resting on top of the stone, and it wasn't really growing out from it. So I went through and pushed the actual wood deeper into the substrate. It allowed for more contact points for anchoring the wood as well. And then it actually seemed like the wood was growing through the rocks or out from it. And that's when the whole layout changed. Now the base feels more grounded and the crown actually stands out as the main focal point. The biggest mistake I almost made in this aquarium, which happens a lot to me, is I almost made the entire foreground and background flat. So what I ended up doing was pushing all of the substrate out towards the back corner of the glass to make a sense of depth. What you don't want to do for a high-tech aquarium is make it seem flat, because then it actually makes your vision pull directly towards the foreground and not creating a sense of depth in the overall aquarium. And again, that's what gave this tank actual depth. I used Contro base, then I capped it down with Contro soil, and the sand that I used was the Maui sand from UNS for the foreground. I almost used a lighter substrate on the high-tech tank, and the reason I didn't is that it shows a lot of buildup a lot quicker and algae. And that really matters in a type of aquarium like this. Lower maintenance from the substrate level really makes an impact, and it makes it easier for you to go through and build this and less maintenance. And instead of using a hard barrier between the sand and the soil, I actually used a subtle buried pebble line, just enough to hold up the transitions naturally. Now with this high-tech aquarium, I used tissue culture plants for the whole thing. And I didn't plant it for how I wanted it to look at day 1. I planted it with the intention of how it was going to grow out. And that's why all the mass stays on one side while the foreground always stays open. And if I would have planted it like this for day 1, it would have completely taken over and looked like a complete mess. So what I did is I held back on moss, buces, anubises, and I let the stem wall do the work first and start to grow out. And then the right side was where I designed it to grow very dense over time. And this layout works because it grows into the shape, not completely dense at one single time. The foreground stayed controlled, and then the midground stayed a lot more texturized, and everything builds towards the stem wall. The CO₂ didn't start perfect in this aquarium at first. It started off too high, so I ended up having to dial it back. So instead of changing the equipment immediately, all I did was I adjusted it around it. I used the flow to help carry the CO2 across the aquarium. And I stuck to one rule the entire time. It turns on 2 hours before the light turns on and 1 hour before the light turns off. That consistently stayed the same and still does to this day. Once the CO2 stabilized across the entire right stem side, that whole mass, I started seeing a lot more growth and it started taking off exponentially. And that's when this tank really started to respond. And funny enough, the drop checker lagged behind as well. So I ended up stopped relying on every little color change from the drop checker. And by when the light fully ramped on, because it has an hour ramp, so by 3 hours, I checked the pH and I made sure there was 1 pH drop, which is my typical rule. I held this tank back on lighting for a lot longer than I typically do. I started around 60% intensity and a shorter photo period. Then I started to gradually ramp that photo period up, even though visually I could have probably pushed it out more. At the final point, I pushed the light up 1 full hour and I watched it for about a week. There was no new algae growth, so that's where I kept it at. And that's how this tank essentially progressed. I slowly increased over time. I watched for any of a response in the tank, new algae growth, was there any even growth from a plant perspective? And I wasn't forcing everything to grow faster. I didn't jump to increase the intensity. I had the tank prove that it could handle every tweak that I was doing along the way. What I did was kind of simple. It just took time and effort. What I first started doing was every day I did a 50% water change, and then I stretched it out. After 2 weeks, I was doing around every other day, and you just keep spreading that out. Along with that, I was also changing out my filter floss every 3 days and my Purigen every week. I also went through in order to get rid of the biofilm at the surface. I had a surface skimmer right here. It'll be a link in the description so you can pick one up as well, to add some surface agitation to it. And this is just more of a rinse and repeat cycle until the tank fully settles in. What you don't want to do is do panic changes or chasing your settings or any mass light adjustments, because that's where people mess up. They react too fast and make drastic changes to the aquarium. Eventually, water started to clear, the film reduced, my diatoms slowed down, and the tank finally started to stabilize. The tank didn't become this from planting, it made it into where it is today from trimming the plants. First, I trimmed the right stem side only, and I cut the tops and replanted them. Second, I then started to tighten the shape. And then thirdly, I started to build for more density. And I didn't touch everything at the start. All of my stems that are in the main tree structure I left, and a lot of my foreground plants I didn't touch for the first 2 months. I let them start to grow out. And with each trim I made, the tank started to become cleaner, more tighter and dense, and more intentional. And that's when I really started to see everything take off and look amazing. I didn't rush livestock in this aquarium at first. I added my cleanup crew, then my shrimp. I started out with Amanos, Nerites, then I moved to my blue bolts after 4 months. And even now, this tank isn't finished. Yes, it's matured, it's stable, but I'm still refining it every other week when I go through and do my maintenance on it. I know you want to keep a tank like this stable, so make sure you check out my next video, because that's where most people lose it. Not at the setup itself, but right after water changes.